There it is.
All right, we are live, it looks like. So welcome those who are tuning in to Sociology 101 and a conversation with our friend Chris Date. Those who listen regularly are familiar with Chris because he and I have had several discussions over the years, and including the most recent one on the Unbelievable broadcast with Justin Brierley, and then interactions on Facebook there afterwards, all of which I've thoroughly enjoyed. We are even talking about the possibility of Chris working with us and the Trinity Commission and doing some podcasts with us. And he's one of those fellow brothers that disagrees with us on soteriological issues, but at the same time, he's also not overly disagreeable, and he is able to look past our theological differences and maintain cordiality and friendship and respect, which is what we all should be able to do. Isn't that a nice thing? We had a conversation yesterday with JD Martin, who's a different kind of Calvinist, I think, than Chris Date is. I think Chris would be the first one to say he has some differences with some of that conversation as he was making some comments. But Chris, welcome to this discussion. I appreciate you coming on.
The appreciation is all mine. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, Chris suggested that maybe we talk through some of this because I think, Chris, tell me if I'm not mistaken here, or if I am mistaken here, that you had seen some of my broadcast and or post where I talk about the Westminster Confession of Faith in particular, and on one particular meme, I used that quote in support of a libertarian view of free will, saying that even Calvinists historically have affirmed, at least from my understanding and definition of libertarian freedom, in portions of their statements, they have affirmed what I would consider libertarian freedom, and you've just pushed back on that and said that's not true. And so, is that a fair kind of assessment as how this conversation came to be?
Yeah, I had heard it from you once or twice, and then I saw it mentioned in passing in your discussion with JD yesterday. And I could be wrong, but my understanding is that the way that you've characterized what the confession has to say about free will doesn't accurately represent what the confession actually says. So that was kind of my motivation. And if I end up being proven wrong, no skin off my back, right? I don't have to change my view just because I turn out to have been wrong on Westminster. I don't think I'm wrong about Westminster.
Right. Now, I have the page open on the other one so that I can see the comments, but I'm not seeing this live stream on my page. And I'm wondering if you're able to see it, or it says that we're live on YouTube, but I'm just not able to pull it up like I was yesterday when I was talking with JD.
Well, if I go to Soteriology 101 in YouTube and click on videos, the top left one, it says live now, and it's you and I, and it says there are 11 people watching.
Okay, well, good. You can see it, but I can't. I'm not sure why I can't. But
I'm special.
Yeah. Google has, maybe YouTube has cut me out of the loop and not let me watch live feeds or whatever it may be. I'm not sure exactly why, but I'll continue to try to upload that because I would like to be able. No, there it is. I can see it now. I'd like to be able to watch the comments on the side, and it's like Trinity Radio right there with either Jonathan or Braxton's probably commenting on that. Just look at these two, he says. So see, I want to be able to see funny comments like that as we're having this discussion. So just to add to the discussion. So what we decided to do is I would start and give kind of a overview presentation of what I see as the major issues here, and explain why I'm justified, or I feel like I'm justified in stating that the Westminster Confession, at least by the words that I read, do sufficiently establish a libertarian freedom of the will of pre-fallen man, Adam and Eve, namely. And so let me share this page with you. That way, I was telling Chris beforehand, I'm a visual learner, and I know that many of our listeners are probably visual learners as well. And it helps to see things on the screen sometimes whenever you're trying to understand something that's kind of complicated, especially much of the philosophical issues that we're going to be talking about. So I'm putting my presentation up for you to see that, and I think it's there now. So let's begin first by defining what we mean by one, libertarian free will, LFW, and compatibilistic free will, which is marked there by CFW. And these are the definitions that Chris had sent to me earlier. And so in other words, these aren't definitions I've just made up. These are ones that he sent to me for our conversation. So, and I've highlighted it there so that you can kind of see the difference between these two worldviews. So libertarian freedom is defined as freedom to do or do not without one's choice being infallibly determined by factors external to oneself. Now follow that. I know that's maybe hard to follow the first time you read it, so just really let that sink in. In other words, on my view, a choice is free and the agent is held morally responsible if the agent himself has some measure of control over the factors that decisively determine that choice. And on CFW, on compatibilism, Chris's view, he would say that freedom to do or do not and be morally responsible despite one's choice being infallibly determined by factors external to oneself. So in other words, let me break that down. On Chris's view, a choice is free and the agent is morally responsible, even if his choices are determined by external factors. So catch that. Even if it's determined by external factors, Chris would say that they are still free and they are still morally responsible for their choices. So if Adam,
at least certain external factors.
Okay, well, we can get more into that and the details of it as we go through this. And so here's the bottom line as I see it. And Chris, I'll give him equal time after I kind of do this presentation, and he can kind of pick this apart as much as he wants, and then we can have a discussion over it. Here's the bottom line. Morally accountable choices are either determined by factors external to the morally accountable agent, or they're not. I guess that's kind of the basics of, as I see it. Either morally accountable choices are determined by factors external to the morally accountable agent, i.e. God's eternal unchangeable decree, or they're not. And so I'm saying they're not. Chris is saying they are determined by factors external to the morally accountable agent. So that's kind of the issue between us, the differences between our views. But now the question for our discussion is this: does the Westminster Confession of Faith affirm that the choices of Adam and Eve were determined by external factors or not? Because that would determine whether the Westminster divines were supporting the libertarian view of free will or the compatibilistic view of free will. And so that's the question, as I understand it, that we're trying to determine whether the Westminster divines, the people who wrote the Westminster Confession, like 121 of them or something like that, gathered up and did this over a period of several years, where they came up with this confession. And were they, in their words, presenting a more libertarian view of freedom of the will or a compatibilistic view of the freedom of the will? Meaning, do they believe Adam and Eve before the fall were determined by external factors or not? And so notice I did not say, this is an important point, and I hope Chris acknowledges this as well, and we can talk more about this, but I didn't say that the Westminster Confession consistently affirms libertarian freedom throughout the entire statement, because I don't believe it does. In fact, I've believed and stated several times that I think that Westminster affirms a blatant contradiction, but that's really beside the point of this discussion. My only point is to demonstrate that at least points 1 and 2 of chapter 9 of the Westminster do in fact give a sufficient affirmation of libertarian free will as he's even defined it with regard to pre-fallen Adam and Eve. And so let's look at those points in order here just quickly. 1, God hath endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to do good or evil. Now, I could talk about the natural liberty and what that means. Natural liberty would obviously be an innate freedom or a freedom granted or endued by God. It's not forced. We could go over the definition of what forced is. Is it an external type of a force, internal type of force? What do we mean by force? What do the divines mean by the force? All those kinds of things. Absolute necessity. The word necessity is often used in place of the word determinism, at least in the early writings. And so we can go over that too. But really what I want to focus on is the same word that Chris himself chose to use, because according to this statement, it says nor determined. So in other words, the statement that's in question here says Adam and Eve's choices are not determined, nor determined to do good or evil. And so in my mind, at least, and Chris can, obviously rebut this seems to already contradict Chris's definition of compatibilism, compatibilistic choices, which are, according to him, infallibly determined by external factors. And so the WCF says nor determined, but Chris's definition says they are infallibly determined. And so I'm just pointing out, if it's not determined, which is what the confession says, that is therefore libertarian freedom of the will, if it's not determined. And so that's the first point I would try to make. Now, it seems the best Chris could claim is that the authors of the Westminster don't mean determined in the way that Chris means it, or how Chris defines it, which really goes to that whole issue of having the same vocabulary but a different dictionary. And then that would put, I think, an undue burden on readers like myself of trying to decipher among the different kinds of Calvinists as to what they mean by the word determined. And so I would think that the best Chris could do is just say, well, they determine it. They define determination differently than I do, and thus, granting his form of determined, the word determined is different than mine. It goes on to say, man in his state of innocency had freedom. And so what kind of freedom are we talking about here? That's the big question. What kind of freedom is being referred to? Is it libertarian freedom or compatibilistic freedom? Compatibilistic freedom being, again, determined by factors beyond the agent's control or outside of the agent's control or external to the agent, as Chris put it. Is the word freedom here actually mean not determined, as the first point already said, nor determined. And the power to will and to do that which was good and well-pleasing to God, but yet mutably so that they might fall from it. And so this seems to be a contra-causal kind of a choice. I mean, in other words, it has both to be able to sin or not to sin. That is a basic foundation for understanding of libertarian freedom, and a self-determined, if you will, as some like to define it. And so I also want to just point out that most Calvinists, at least in my experience, and that is limited because I know there are other kinds of Calvinists out there, and I'm sure Chris can bring us to attention some other scholars from his worldview who would agree with his perspective, and I welcome that. But most Calvinists, at least in my experience, have punted to mystery on the question of why Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. And it seems Chris isn't willing to punt to that mystery, but instead is willing to tell us exactly why Adam and Eve sinned, because ultimately God decreed it. In other words, God determined it by factors beyond or external to the agent. But that's not, of course, what we know John Piper has said. For example, John Piper says, how God freely hardens and yet preserves human accountability, we are not explicitly told. It is the same mystery as to how the first sin entered the universe. How does a sinful disposition arise from a good heart? The Bible does not tell us. R.C. Sproul similarly teaches, but Adam and Eve were not created fallen. They had no sin nature. They were good creatures with a free will, yet they chose to sin. Why? I do not know, nor have I found anyone yet who does know. And so tongue-in-cheek, firmly planted there, Chris, I guess if Sproul had met you, you could have told him that the reason that Adam did sin is because God decreed for Adam to sin, and that he was determined to sin by external factors beyond his control. And so in closing, I want to play a little clip, if I'm able to do this with the technology the way that it works here, by sharing just an audio clip from our mutual friend, Dr. James White. And so let me see if this works. Let me know, Chris, if you can't hear this or something doesn't work.
Oh, I don't think you enabled the audio this time. You only shared your screen. You didn't share your audio this time.
Oh, I did push that button.
Well, there's a checkbox in the dialog that opens when you click share in Zoom or something like that. And you have to say enable desktop audio as well, not just the screen.
Yeah, it has it. Share computer sound.
Well, maybe try one more time then.
Okay.
See, now Zoom is telling me that you're sharing your computer sound.
But
how's that?
Jonathan Edwards tried to figure out your will predestined to chip of the sovereign decree of God and the fallen will of Adam. Almost your will used that. Now, the big question is, but But what comes first, the chicken or the egg type of a situation? How can God have a decree that includes evil? Well, the one thing, the real issue here only comes down to Adam. It really doesn't come down to us, because we are fallen, and as it is, the Bible says God restrains our evil. So if he has to restrain our evil, then obviously, once we're in the fallen state, this isn't all that difficult an issue to deal with.
This is well understood.
But the question has to do with Adam. And there was a really, really brilliant guy that thought he had figured this out. Not sure if you ever heard a discussion of this in all the many programs you've done, Justin. But Jonathan Edwards tried to figure out the relationship of the sovereign decree of God and the will of the unfallen Adam.
Okay.
Now remember, how much divine revelation do we have on the nature of the unfallen will of Adam? Almost nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, there just isn't almost anything there, right?
Okay.
And even John Gerstner, who is a huge fan of Jonathan Edwards, said, here we see the great mind of Edwards trapped in a morass and quicksand of self-contradiction. Because, look, here was the difference between Edwards and Calvin. Both huge minds. But Edwards was willing to speculate on matters outside of divine revelation. And one of the specific mottos of Calvin was, when God makes an end of speaking, so must we. And so if God has not given us the divine revelation to even know the nature of Adam's will, to try to speculate beyond that will always end up getting us into a world of hurt. And yet many people do exactly that. And this is where epistemological humility comes in, but this is revelatory humility.
Okay. Hopefully that came through okay. And the reason I played that was I think that he's acknowledging something I wanted to acknowledge, but I thought it would come stronger from a fellow Calvinist, of saying that even Calvinists have disagreements among themselves. I know Oliver Crisp, who is a well-known Calvinist, has written a book called Deviant Calvinism, which he supports a libertarian view of Calvinism, where he actually does think that the Westminster allows for a libertarian view of freedom. And so some of this may be same vocabulary, different dictionary kinds of issues that we're getting into. But the reason I wanted to present all of that is just to say this is not a cut and dry issue. And I also want to point out that Chris, I think from my discussion with him, is approaching this with a humility of saying, like he already said earlier in the program, I could be wrong with this, but it's not changing much of anything. I mean, this is just something we're bantering about and discussing. Whether I'm wrong or he's wrong about what the Westminster Divines had in mind, or vocabulary wise, what it means, neither one of our views is destroyed by that by any chance, any stretch of imagination. It's just simply, am I justified as a non-Calvinist to use the Westminster Confession as my proof to say even Calvinistic confessions affirm at least a view of libertarian freedom that seems to be consistent with my understanding of libertarian freedom, and that's why we're pushing back and forth on each other. Hopefully that's fair, Chris, and I'll turn it over to you. I take at least 15 minutes here or a little more, so I'll let you have more than that, as much time as you want to go through what you want to go through.
Well, I appreciate that, and but at least for this sort of introduction to our discussion, I don't think I'll need much more than 2 or 3 minutes. I found it very interesting that you quoted in full the particular statement in the confession, and then you, for the whole rest of your monologue, and I don't mean that in any sort of derogatory way, but throughout the whole rest of your monologue, you inserted an ellipsis in place of the full statement, and you brought the words "nor" and "determined" together as if they the one followed immediately after the other. But as your very own document shows, those two words aren't next to each other. What the article says is, and this is, as you pointed out, chapter 9, article 1, God hath endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to do good or evil. Now, the important thing here is that it doesn't say nor determined. It says nor determined by something in particular, namely absolute necessity of nature. So right off the bat, as clever and as much kudos as I give you for thinking that you had highlighted sort of the silver bullet to my case, it obviously did not, because in order for the silver bullet to function in the way that you had intended, you'd have to, that ellipsis would have to be legitimate, and it's not. It's limiting determination. It's excluding determination by a particular means, namely necessity of nature. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is you asked if when the confession talks about freedom, it's somehow, or you suggested the possibility at least, that when it talks about freedom, it means freedom from any sort of determination, any sort of theological determinism. But I think that's a misreading of the confession. And for this, I want to encourage readers to check out a blog post at Helm's Deep, which is the blog of Paul Helm. And the blog post is called Freedom, Liberty, and the Westminster Confession. And he interacts a little bit with Oliver Crisp, and so does the other article I'm going to mention a little bit later when we get to that point. But in this blog post, and listeners, just so you know, Leighton and I talked about this beforehand. After this conversation is over and this gets published on demand on YouTube, the description will be updated with a link to this blog post. But in the blog post, Paul Helm correctly explains that in the confession, freedom, or freely, the word freely, has invariably to do with spiritual ability, the enjoyment of the effects of divine grace. He says freedom does not denote a metaphysical view, but a moral and spiritual state, often referred to as freedom from the bondage of the will. In other words, when the confession talks about freedom, it's talking about freedom from the influence of a sinful nature upon one's choices. So Adam and Eve were free, according to the confession, in the sense that they weren't bound by a fallen nature to sin. But what the confession isn't saying when it talks about the language of freedom is that they were free of any sort of external factors determining their choices whatsoever. That's not the confession's point. So that's the second point that I wanted to make. Thirdly, and I'm almost done, I don't think that the quotations from R.C. Sproul and John Piper, or for that matter, James White, I don't think that those are, in fact, again, as clever as your way of putting it was, I don't think those are actually in conflict with me. If I was asked, why did let me put it this way. If I were to pick up a story, a novel by some author, and some character in the book did something, and it didn't tell me why the character in the book did it, and somebody said, well, why did the character do such and such? My answer wouldn't be, well, the author wrote it. My answer would be, I don't know. The book doesn't tell me. See, there's a difference between the author of a novel and what's taking place in the novel. And there are causes in the novel, but those causes may not be given. And if they're not given, we don't know what in the timeline, what in the narrative of the story is causing something to happen or causing somebody to do something. But that doesn't preclude an author from having written that being what happens. So I think that my answer is absolutely consistent with what R.C. Sproul and John Piper said, namely, I don't know why Adam sinned. What I do know, and what the confession explicitly states, is that he was predetermined to do it. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the course of this conversation. So that was the third thing. And then one last thing, you said that James White is our mutual friend. I know you were being a little bit tongue-in-cheek there. Just in case he hears this, I just want him to know, I wish I could say that James White is a friend of mine. I have the utmost of respect and love for him. I don't agree with him on some things, but it's a tragedy in my eyes that whatever relationship I might have at one point started to have with James White has fallen by the wayside because of my views on hell. And James, I hope that if you hear this, you'll know I've still got the utmost of respect for you. And I hope that you think that I'm representing the Westminster Confession here accurately. So I'll stop there, and then we can just sort of let the conversation unfold.
Sure. And I think you make a good point by pointing out the nature, the absolute necessity. But when it comes to the question of, okay, why did Adam sin? Is it not true, on your view, that ultimately Adam sinned because God decreed it?
Well, depending upon what you mean by ultimately and because, yeah. I mean, I think I would say I don't know what in time caused Adam to sin. And the confession says as much. I mean, it says he was free from the nature, from a fallen nature. But that doesn't mean that God didn't foreordain it to happen immutably, to use the language of the confession. It's sort of that distinction I offered between the author of a novel and what's taking place in the novel, right? There are causes in the narrative, like let's say somebody accidentally ran to third base instead of first from home plate when he hits the ball, right? In this narrative, the cause could be that the batter was drunk, right? Or, or high or something like that. We don't know, but maybe it doesn't tell me. But that's not the same thing as saying the author wrote it, or the author, it's saying that I don't know what caused the batter to do that doesn't mean I'm denying that an author wrote that. And similarly, not perfectly analogous, I distinguish between God's transcendent eternal decree, his foreordination, his immutable decree of what's going to take place in time. I distinguish between that and what in time might cause an agent to do this or that thing.
Right. Yeah. And we've talked a little bit about that, at least indirectly, possibly in talking to each other's podcast about, or replying to each other's podcast on some of those points. But for example, to use the example of the author of a book, the reason that the Wicked Witch of the West set the straw man on fire, you could say, well, I don't know why she did that, because maybe the book author doesn't write that.
Exactly.
But the shortcoming of that analogy, obviously, is that they aren't real people.
Sure.
And they're not independent of the imagination of Frank Baum, which, or is it Frank Baum? I think that's the author.
I don't know.
Oz, Wizard of Oz. Then there's no distinction between the desire of the author and that of the made up creature. And so obviously every analogy does fall short, and where it falls short is in particularly exactly where the problem with Calvinism is, and that is there is nothing on which to base human freedom and responsibility, in so much as there's nothing distinguished between what a man desires and what God desires in his eternal decree for him to desire. There's no basis for human responsibility, any more so than there is a basis for condemning the Wicked Witch of the West, who is a fictional character who has no desire independent of or different from that which Frank Baum has written for her to have.
Sure. And I'm not particularly objecting to that here, but I want to make clear what we're discussing here is not whether or not the distinction I've offered can be maintained and yet maintain human moral responsibility. That's another question. What I'm here saying is that this is the kind of relationship that the confession reflects between divine decree and human action in time. In the same way that, yes, you're absolutely right. In the analogy I've offered, the fictional narrative is not they're not real people with real wills, etc. But if they were, that's the kind of relationship that we Reformed, or at least some of us Reformed, including the authors of the Confession, see between the decree and what takes place in time. There might be any number of effects and causes in time, but ultimately all of them, whatever they might be, are under the they are sovereignly and immutably, again, to use the language of the Confession, decreed to come about exactly the way they do. Right.
Now, the word forced, would you accept this definition? And I'm just reading from the dictionary I pulled up here. It says, forced is a forced action is something you do because someone else causes or makes you do it. Or the second one, the adjective, the second one is a forced action is something that you do because circumstances make it necessary. And so the fact that they do say specifically it's not forced, that seems to at first reading at least fly in the face of a infallible determination based upon factors outside of the agent. If that's not force, what is?
Oh, I think the answer to that question is fairly easy. I don't think that, to use your analogy, the Wicked Witch of the West or whatever, or is it East? My memory is terrible. I don't think the Wicked Witch was forced to do anything that she did in that narrative, but she was written to. And in the same way, I see forced, at least in this, in the context of this discussion, as having to do with you are made or caused to do something by one of what the Confession calls secondary causes. So if you were to insert the word secondary before cause or make or whatever in the definition that you just read, I think the Confession would be fully on board. There was no secondary cause, nothing in time that caused Adam and Eve to fall the way they did. But what that doesn't rule out is that God has immutably foreordained what will come about. And in fact, the confession explicitly says it was immediate. In fact, I'll just read it really quickly, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, please do.
So this is chapter 5, Article 2. I'll read first. It says, although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he ordereth them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. Now, I'm going to keep going here in a second, but what I want to point out to the viewer here, or listener, depending on how you're watching this or listening to it, what I want to point out here is that there's two things this article, chapter 5, article 2, affirms. One, that secondary causes can be necessary or free. But two, that whatever the secondary causes, whether they're necessary causes or free causes or contingent causes, and there I'm not even quite sure I understand what it's talking about, but whatever the nature of the secondary cause, it's still immutably and infallibly falling out of, to use the language of this article, the decree of God and the first cause, it says. So you've got a distinction between first and second. But now the next thing I want to read really quickly, and then I'll be done and I'll turn the microphone back over to you, is Article 4 of chapter 5. The Almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extendeth itself even to the first fall and all other sins of angels and men, and not by a bare permission, but such as hath joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding. And on it goes. The point being that what Adam and Eve did was free. It was an expression of the kind of liberty they were created with, namely a liberty that was not bound by fallen nature, unlike all of their progeny. But nevertheless, that action was the result of, it was bounded by the most wise and powerful God, chapter 5, article 4 says. That God's foreordination, his immutable and infallible decree, extends all the way back to that very first sin.
What do you think James White was warning against with regard to Jonathan Edwards' conclusions that Gershner also brought attention to, if not the exact conclusions that you're bringing with regard to the sovereign, unchangeable, determined decree of God being the ultimate cause, decisive factor in Adam and Eve's choice?
I don't want to try and read James White's mind. And I know that you're not asking me.
Okay, Gershner. Okay, but then Gershner then.
Or Gershner. What I would need in order to be able to even meaningfully, and I'm honestly not trying to dodge this. And if you want to provide me with the context I'm about to request.
Yeah, you need to see it. I understand. I can say we can reserve the right for you to see it within the context. But I would just point out that I think that the disagreement that some of the more, I guess, modified Calvinists on this particular point, at least, are trying to warn against is speaking outside or beyond the text and speculating that the reason that Adam and Eve ultimately sinned were for factors beyond their control or external to themselves, i.e. the determinative decree of God. And
that's where you and I disagree, because whatever it is that James White is allegedly responding to and Gershner is allegedly responding to and so forth, and again, I just don't know the context there, but whatever it is that they're talking about, I think that what is being cautioned is speculation as to what in time caused Adam to sin, despite his lack of a fallen nature. So what's being cautioned against is not, don't chalk this up to the sovereign decree of God. I guarantee you that if I shouldn't say guarantee, I am 99% certain that if James White ever gets around to watching this, he'll say, yeah, God perfectly, immutably, and infallibly, to use the language of this confession, decreed that Adam would fall and that he was bound to do it. But what I think James White would caution against, and what I think the other authors are cautioning against, is speculating as to what, besides a fallen nature, since Adam didn't have one, motivated him, caused him, whatever, in time to do what he did. Again, it's that distinction between the transcendent decree of God and the imminent unfolding of causes and effects in time.
Maybe we have time to look at Gershner's, comment that he just read that talked about John Calvin stepped into a morass of contradiction, because that's what I see. When I see the Westminster, when I see Edwards, I see a morass of contradictions. Of course, maybe God determined for me, actually, if you're right, God did determine for me to see it as a morass of contradiction, but that's beside the point.
It's not only beside the point, but it's a joke that seems to be repeated ad nauseum, and that's fine.
It's not a joke. It's true. On your system, God did unchangeably decree for me to believe
that doesn't make it any less
Westminster is.
It's an attempt to be humorous or an attempt to be.
No, it's not. It's an attempt to show the irrationality of the system itself, because ultimately you're rebuking me for something you believe God unchangeably and infallibly decreed and decided for me to do.
But as you know, I would not concede that that is irrational or incoherent. But anyway, before you go to Gerstner, and I'm not going to tell you not to, but before you do, I just want to reiterate that what I'm here in this conversation wanting to talk about is not whether or not the confession is incoherent because it's self-contradictory. I'm willing to discuss the things you want to talk about.
Sure.
That's not what I really am here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about today is what are the authors of the confession saying? And if you look at the way the authors of the confession use the language of liberty, of freedom, of infallibility and immutability in God's decree, what can be expressed, what is being expressed by the authors of the confession, whether it's coherent or not, is not that Adam and Eve had libertarian free will. What they're affirming is that they were unfettered by a fallen nature.
Well, and that's where we disagree, because I think even though you may claim there's a different vocabulary, different dictionary behind the Westminster's intentions, and maybe that's the case, I'm saying based upon, it's just like whenever somebody says, I believe God's absolutely sovereign. And a Calvinist says that, and I say, yeah, I agree. We have a different vocabulary for the same, we have a different dictionary, same vocabulary. And so that's why I can say I affirm this statement. I affirm what he's saying because it does sufficiently, based upon my definitions of these terms, define what libertarian free will looks like, the ability to sin or not to sin in a given context.
You confirm this article, but not the whole confession.
Correct. That's correct.
And this is what I'm trying to push back on, is that I think just as we would in here's a rough, an imperfect analogy, as all analogies are. In the book of Acts, as you know, Paul is recorded as saying the men with him on the road to Emmaus didn't hear the voice or whatever, or didn't see the light or whatever. And then later in the book, Luke records Paul telling somebody else what seems on the surface to be a contradiction to what was recorded earlier. But most of us, when we're going to interpret Luke's words and Paul's own words in there, we want to say, well, let's start by giving the author the benefit of the doubt that he thinks he's being consistent with himself. Now, it may be that he's not. He may be saying one thing at one point and saying something totally else at the other and not realizing it. Yes, that's possible. Right. But before we entertain that possibility, let's entertain the possibility that they meant both things and thought they were consistent. And if we approach this confession in the same way as a work of literature, we have chapter 3, in which God is said to have unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass without taking away the liberty of second causes. And we have chapter 5, which has those articles that I just read a moment ago, which says that God's immutable and infallible decree boundingly results in that first fall even. And all of these things come 4 chapters at least before the chapter that we're talking about, which says Adam and Eve had this freedom and this liberty.
Right.
So at least if we grant for the sake of argument, that maybe they mean both things and think they're consistent, the logical reading of it would be they don't mean libertarian free will.
Right. I understand your point.
Okay.
I think it's also interesting to point out that the very analogy that you use is authorship, when the confession itself actually says he foreordains everything, including evil. Nevertheless, he's not the author of sin.
Sure.
And yet you use the analogy of authorship to explain how it is that God works to author that which he's not authoring. And again, this is where I see the morass of contradiction. The A equals not A. He's an author, but he's not authoring. Mm-hmm. He's causing it, but he's not really causing it. He's doing it, but he's not really doing it. And all these kinds of, again, sounds like a morass of contradictions to me.
I understand.
And Gerstner, apparently, for at least Edward's view of it.
And that's fine, and we could talk about, if you'd like me to explain how I reconcile that, we could talk about that. But again, I want to reiterate, whether or not it seems like a morass of contradiction to you, and whether or not that perception is accurate, is an entirely separate question from what the authors of this confession meant. And all I'm arguing is that if we treat this as a body of literature and we treat its authors as at least fairly logical writers, we should at least proceed with the assumption until proven otherwise that they meant both things they said and thought that they were consistent with one another. And if you assume those two things until proven otherwise, what you have, and this is consistent with how they use the language of freedom and liberty elsewhere in the confession, you have them affirming they were free from a fallen nature that all of their progeny have. That doesn't exclude, as the language of the earlier article, chapter 3 and chapter 5 explain, that doesn't exclude the secondary causes, other secondary causes that could have brought about the Adam and Eve's first sin, and that being a part of God's immutable and infallible decree. It doesn't preclude that in the language, in the minds of the authors of this confession. So what I'm failing to see is any sufficient reason for thinking that the authors meant one thing in one place and then meant something incompatible with that in the other, or at least something they thought was incompatible or realized was incompatible with the other. They might have not realized that the two things you think are incompatible are in fact incompatible, but nevertheless, they think they are, and what they don't appear to be affirming is libertarian freedom. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Go ahead.
No, well, I wanted to point out here, let's look at this statement here. Mm-hmm. Imagine if we put in parentheses right here with the divines, that the divines, by those that are listening, is what's the short term for the authors of the confession. And so had the divines put in parentheses here, that factors outside of the agent infallibly determined Adam's choice, you don't believe that would sound inconsistent with what this statement is attempting to communicate?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you ask one more time?
If this statement included your definition of compatibilistic freedom, in other words, it said, God hath endued the will of man with...
No, I don't think it would sound incompatible with what you're actually looking at there at all. And the reason is because is for two reasons. One, I think you're using a definition of forced that they didn't mean. And number two, they didn't remove they didn't replace a bunch of words with an ellipsis like you did. And if I'm right about those two things, and I'm infallibly right about the second thing, they didn't replace those words with an ellipsis like you did. But if I'm right about the first thing, that they meant forced with slightly different meaning than what you think, then there's no incompatibility there, no contradiction.
Okay, so let's just put it here and let's just look at it and see.
Mm-hmm. Just make sure that you
to himself.
Remember, you've still got determined to do good or evil bolded, and the last thing that you bolded was the word nor, as if everything in between wasn't there.
We'll take that out. We want to be unfair. Okay. All right, so let's read it. God hath endued the will of man with a natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to do good or evil, despite Adam's choice being infallibly determined by factors external to himself.
Yep. Perfectly consistent.
You really think so?
Oh, yeah. There's literally nothing there that's contradictory. What you have in the first statement, the statement that's actually in the confession, is they weren't forced and they weren't determined by absolute necessity of nature. The second statement does not say their choice was determined by absolute necessity of nature, and it doesn't say they were forced. So there's literally, unless you want to say that forced and determined are co-referring, they're synonymous or whatever, and maybe that's your position and that's fine, but that's not my position, and I don't think it was the divine's position. Unless you want to assume that they are synonymous, there's literally no grounds for saying there's a contradiction there.
So, just speaking in normal layman term, if I, and I know humanity is different than God, but if I somehow could make factors that infallibly determined for you to lie or steal or kill or murder or do something, would you still find, or would you still conclude that you were morally accountable for whatever that thing was, or could be considered morally accountable for whatever that thing was?
Do I want to do what it is that you infallibly determine that I'll do?
Right. Like if I cast a spell on you, have a potion put on you, and cause your desires to be such that you want to lie from now on, would you in that situation refer to your choices as being morally accountable, if indeed in that supposition you were doing that?
So the answer, I'm gonna answer, but I want before you, and I'm not saying you would cut me off, but just in case you might have, before you cut me off, let me elaborate. The answer is yes, I do think I'd be morally responsible in the same way, and I know that you and I have talked about this analogy in the past, and this analogy is imperfect, but I also think that the Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings are morally accountable, even though they were created by their very nature by Saruman by Saruman to do evil, wicked things to the hobbits. So I have no problem saying that somebody that is determined to want to do what they do is morally accountable. And in fact, as somebody who, look, I was 6 or 7 years ago, I had to quit drinking because it had gotten so bad. I was so unable to control myself that almost every night I would drink like a pint of whiskey and a 6-pack of beer. Blacking out was the exception, or the rule rather than the exception. But I had an addiction, and I mean, I still have one, but I'm recovering. I had an addiction that determined that I would do those things, but I still consider myself to have been morally accountable, and that's why I no longer do that, because I think that, or at least it's part of the reason why. So the point I'm getting at is, my short answer to your question is yes, I think what you were determined to do, you can be morally accountable to do. But now let's say that to continue with your analogy, instead of giving me a potion, you grabbed my wrist with a gun in it and you pointed my hand at somebody and forced my finger to pull that trigger against my will, then I wouldn't consider myself morally accountable. And that's what I take the language of forced here to be. It's something in time that is forcing the action. And lastly, and then I'll turn the microphone over, that's a big problem I have with the potion analogy that you gave, because the potion analogy, the potion is a cause in time. It's something that that is categorically different from the transcendent eternal decree of God. So yeah, that's my long answer to your question.
And of course, I would just push back by saying, in what significant way is it not analogous to the eternal, unchangeable, determinative decree? In other words, you can just claim arbitrarily, it just doesn't work, or you can actually show a distinction with a difference between the analogy and the actual cause of.
I think I've done that. Decree. Namely, one of them is a cause that is that takes place in time. It's rooted in time, that overrides a pre-existing will of an agent and makes that agent's will something else. All right. But in the transcendent eternal decree of God, it's, number one, not in time, and therefore not causative in the way that I think you often use the word causative. It's in the same way that the author didn't cause the Wicked Witch of the West to do what she did, but he did write it. He did infallibly decree it. And the other big difference is that in your analogy, the person's will was X at a point in time and then was overridden by a potion in time to become Y, whereas the transcendent decree of God, there is no former will that God overrides by some means to become something other than it had been.
Okay. Well, let me push back on your view in general. And I think we've stepping away a little bit from the question of the discussion, but we can always come back to that as much as we need to. And for the time that we have, and we won't belabor it too long here, because we're going to go about an hour. Before you go on, can I just offer the second resource just so that people can check it out that I mentioned? Yes, go ahead to do that.
Yeah, I won't read anything from this for now, but I would encourage people to check it out. This is by James N. Anderson. This is an article in the Journal of Reformed Theology, issue 11 from 2017. And the name of the article is called "Determined to Come Most Freely, Some Challenges for Libertarian Calvinism." And just like that Paul Helm resource I mentioned earlier, James Anderson in this article interacts with Oliver Crisp and the claim that that the confession is consistent with libertarian free will in places.
Okay.
All right, so go ahead.
So let me push back. I think your view, not intentionally, but I think it does lessen the blameworthiness of man. And even the ReformationTheology.com Calvinistic source, the author there makes this point, which is a point I think you would probably agree with, that fallen man are in bondage to sin and cannot do other than sin and reject the gospel. But Adam was inclined to do good, but was deceived into choosing evil. This made his sin all the more heinous. And the reason I point that out is that he's acknowledging a point that I try to point out with regard to lessening men's blameworthiness by ultimately imposing this philosophical understanding of determinism, i.e., this fallen, depraved inability of fallen humanity that they could not have done otherwise, removes, in my opinion, again, I know you don't share this opinion, but I think it lessens their blameworthiness in the same way that this author is acknowledging that Adam's sin is all the more heinous. Why? Because he could have done otherwise. And the fact that someone is born in a nature or condition where they could not believe, but yet they're held responsible for not believing, seems to me to remove or lessen the blameworthiness of man. And personal responsibility is thus, at least logically, from everything that I can read and understand, removed from that individual, and that therefore it can practically play itself out in a more fatalistic, deterministic way of thinking, which I don't think every Calvinist consistently obviously lives that way, but I think most Calvinists live as if there is libertarian freedom, though they may claim to believe in something different. Now, the point that I want to get to is that the third point in that chapter 9 of the Westminster does go on to say that after the fall, they lost their ability. And so it seems to me the distinction between Adam and Eve's choice to sin, and let's just take the next sin that we hear in Scripture, Cain's choice to bring the wrong sacrifice, for example, or to kill his brother. That is the choice of a sinful person. And you could even say Abel's choice to bring the right sacrifice, which did please God. Those are choices of post-fallen men. Cain and Abel, according to your understanding and the Westminster's understanding, have a different nature. Something has changed between those two people. But yet, it seems to me that if you're interpreting the sovereign decree being infallibly being determined by factors beyond the agent, then there's no real distinction with a difference between the choices of Adam and Eve prior to the fall and the choice of Cain and Abel, because both of them, just like the Wicked Witch of the West in Baum's book, are doing exactly what they're authored to do, not what they're choosing to do based upon their given nature in a given circumstance, because it's ultimately scripted based upon the infallible decree, not upon an actual choice of the free will agent, if that makes sense.
Oh, I mean, it makes sense. I understand why you think that, but you were right. I disagree, and that's fine. To me, this continues to boil down to the distinction between the transcendent decree of God and the imminent unfolding of time and history. The reason I do think it's a distinction with a difference. Yes, I am willing, I think, and I would have to give this more thought, but I think I'd be willing to agree that the sin of Adam and Eve was more heinous than, say, my sins, because my sins are the result, in part at least, of the fallen nature with which I was conceived. I don't have a will unfettered by a sin nature as Adam and Eve did. And so I'm totally, I shouldn't say totally, my gut tells me, yes, I think I'm willing to say there's a difference in degree of heinousness there because my choice was impacted by a fallen nature that Adam didn't have. However, there's still, in my mind anyway, a distinction with a difference between that and this concept of God's transcendent decree determining what will happen. Because in the one case, we're talking about factors that are playing out in time, and we're talking about we're talking about a difference between two categories of people. On the one hand, Adam and Eve, and on the other half, all of their progeny. A difference that is rooted in time and space, namely a fallen nature. But when we talk about, and by way of analogy, that would be like saying that the Wicked Witch in the story was brought up in a terrible home that oriented her to doing wicked things, whereas let's say the Good Witch of the East, or again, I don't remember the names, but the Good Witch was, let's say, raised in a good Christian home or something like that. And so for her, if she had done what the Wicked Witch did, her choice would be all the more heinous because she wasn't predisposed by her upbringing to do wicked things X, Y, or Z, and yet she did them anyway, unlike the Wicked Witch. But the author, having written both of the two characters' timelines, both the Wicked Witch and the Good Witch, the author has still infallibly and immutably written in both cases what's going to happen. And at least in my mind, that doesn't negate the moral responsibility of either the good or the bad witch. Now, I know that,
and as you've said before, I just can't relate to you on that point.
And exactly, right. So by
God's decree. And I'm not joking when I say that.
Fair enough. So, yeah.
Okay. So, well, let me push back. And we've used the Hobbit analogy before with the Lord of the Rings and the Uruk-hai. Those that listen to the previous discussion, but I know new people would be tuning in, and so I wanted to push back on just that analogy.
Sure.
I think that the Uruk-hai are less blameworthy than if a Hobbit, for example, chose to do an evil thing, because the Hobbit has a nature by which he can make free choices, whereas the Uruk-hai can only do who Saruman, whatever his name is, has determined for them to do. And therefore, I think the blameworthiness is heightened in the Hobbit's nature, because the Hobbit has the capacity to choose right and wrong.
And I think I conceded to that a moment ago.
Right. And so that's why, and that's why that's one of the reasons, practically at least speaking, that I push against the deterministic framework, because I do believe that it in some cases, at least, if nothing else, causes people to act outside of personal individual responsibility for their choices, because they figure, rightly or wrongly, whether they should have figured this or not, well, I must be determined by God to do these bad things. If I looked at pornography yesterday, it must be because God decreed it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. It was, I made every choice that I made according to these external factors beyond my control, i.e. the decree of God, thus causing that individual to not take responsibility for his addiction and for his choices to drink alcohol, like you mentioned earlier, or due to some other vice, because ultimately he rightly, if Calvinism is true, if determinism is true, he can rightly say, well, God determined for me to do it. And anyone who's in the mental health profession knows that every addict, that's exactly what they're looking for, is an excuse for their behavior. And what better excuse is there than God unchangeably authored for me, or wrote this out for me to do this for his own glory, nonetheless. So I'm actually bringing God glory on Calvinism by looking at pornography yesterday. That to me just absolutely flies in the face of what we know about human decisions and choices and responsibility, as well as what's needed for taking personal accountability and responsibility for our choices and actions.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot that you said there, and I know we don't have a lot of time left. So what I'll just say is that number one, as I already conceded, I think I'm inclined to agree that the Uruk-hai are less culpable than the Hobbits, if the Hobbits had done the very same things. And so I agree with you there. Where we might disagree is that if the Lord of the Rings, when I watch the Lord of the Rings, I'm no less convinced of the moral accountability of the Uruk-hai, knowing that they were scripted to do what they've done by the writer by J.R.R. Tolkien and by the screenwriter of the movie. I'm no less convinced of their moral accountability because I know that they've been scripted to do it than if I thought they hadn't been scripted to do it. And this is why, for me, the distinction between God's transcendent decree and what takes place in time is a relevant factor. As for
and you do recognize that the analogy itself makes God like Saruman. And that's the problem.
Well, actually, I don't agree. I think the analogy makes Adam and Eve like Saruman, because it's not God who made the Uruk-hai with a fallen nature. It was Adam and Eve who made their progeny with a fallen nature.
I would disagree, because Adam had no power to make his progeny incapable of responding to God and his choices. That had to be invoked by the divine power.
Well, fair enough, but it was the result of their choice, their free choice, according to the confession, to do what they did. So if it hadn't been for Adam and Eve sinning, apart from in the freedom from a sinful nature, then their progeny wouldn't be fallen in the way that we are.
Of course, remembering Adam's choice was unchangeably and infallibly decreed and caused by factors outside of Adam's control.
By God, yes.
Correct. That's Saruman.
Well, no, Saruman is, as I said, Adam, but we can disagree there. The second thing I want to say, though, is just I want to be very careful not to argue against the truthfulness of a claim because of how that claim might be abused by certain people who hear it. And I think I could turn the tables on your side of this debate, because I could say, look, there are all sorts of people who who end up really beating themselves up and feeling miserable about themselves. I could conceive of people even going so far as to commit suicide because they feel like they have failed in the evangelistic endeavor to offer enough evidence or whatever to persuade their interlocutor. Whereas I think even you would agree that we as evangelists aren't solely responsible for that. The person we're evangelizing has a responsibility there, and the role of the Holy Spirit in what you might call, I don't want to make any assumptions here, prevenient grace, there's a responsibility there as well. And so The fact that some people might interpret libertarian free will as giving them reason to beat themselves up and even go so far as to kill themselves because they're a miserable failure in evangelism does not mean that libertarian freedom is false. I mean, we could at least agree on that, right?
Yeah, to some level, it's obviously a difference. I do believe Paul talks about washing his hands of the blood by bringing the message. So he does consider that he has a level of responsibility, which I believe is a passage out of Ezekiel as well, that the watchman has a level of responsibility
and I agree.
The message.
But not so much that you would feel comfortable, like somebody should burden the entire responsibility themselves. Right.
Well, I would much rather, if you're going to side on this, there's a ditch on both sides, obviously, but I would much rather fall on the side of someone feeling the conviction of bringing the gospel message versus somebody releasing the burden of feeling like they need to share the gospel, which is what more of a hyper version of Calvinism. The ditch on the other side would be, well, I don't really need to share at all because God's going to save who He's going to save. And if I don't really want to evangelize, it must be because God did decree for me to have the desire to evangelize.
I don't care which ditch you prefer. That's not my point. My point is just that either of our two views can be true, even if some percentage of people abuse the truth and end up taking it into the ditch.
Yes, I would concede that there is a seed that can be taken from either side with regard to different things. I do feel like, I think Austin Fisher puts it in his book, Young, Restless, No Longer Reformed. He said it seems to him that the determinists are more concerned with people taking too much credit for their salvation, whereas we are concerned as free will theists with the recognizably good God. And that's part of the problem is that even the analogies that you used, you have God authoring, or at least scripting or decreeing moral, heinous evil and rape and being like Sauron and all these kinds of things. I would much rather side on the error of our problems than the ones where we would impugn the character and the goodness of our God. And so that's where I would just warn people to say that we got to be really careful with the kind of ditch that we're falling into.
I'll agree with you there, with the caveat that I don't actually think my view does paint God out in that way. And of course, you think it does, but the
by God's decree.
By God's decree, yet again, I can't count the number of times this has happened. Anyway, but putting that aside,
it's true.
Yeah, well, it was the truth the first time you said it. You didn't have to say it a bajillion times. But anyway, putting that aside,
I also say it because it annoys you. Just so you know.
So if it didn't annoy me, you wouldn't do it as much.
Probably not.
I'm sure you would, because you do it all the time, even outside of conversations with me. But anyway, no. If I thought that my view did in fact challenge the goodness of God, then I would agree with you. I would rather err on the side of libertarianism than on the making God accountable for evil. But I will say, I think that if people want to check out the work of Guillaume Bignon in his book, I think it's called Excusing God or Excusing Sinners and Blaming God or something like that. I think he demonstrates that philosophically there isn't in fact an argument against the goodness of God from compatibilist free will. So I'll just encourage listeners to check that out. Whether they end up agreeing with them or not is of course another question.
All right. Well, we've come up on our hour mark. And so I appreciate this discussion. I think we were able to unpack some of the difference in the way we might understand the Westminster Divines and what they meant. I think Chris is probably right in the sense that the Westminster Divines probably didn't intend to say what I would recognizably see as libertarian freedom of the will. I do believe that his statement sounds completely contradictory to what I read because there's the same vocabulary, different dictionary, as far as I can see it. That's one of the reasons I can say things like, I believe God's sovereign and still disagree with what a Calvinist means by saying it. And so I do acknowledge, and I have, I think, always acknowledged that the Westminster Confession Divines disagree with my perspective overall. My point has always been that I think these two explanations of pre-fallen man fit my explanation, at least my vocabulary of those explanations, my definition of those explanations of libertarian free will. But I also acknowledge that behind the scenes, even though if you look at the history of the Westminster Confession and its writings, there were disagreements among the divines over several of these points. There was some debate among them. So that's another issue with the whole Calvinism not being a monolithic group, and that there are, like Oliver Crisp and others who try to maintain a libertarian freedom within the Calvinistic framework. And so, and Chris acknowledges that. I mean, Chris is not denying that. And so I will try to put those two links that you had sent me earlier that you mentioned, Chris, in the show notes of this broadcast. That way people can go resource and look through Paul Helms and Anderson's book, chapters there and read a little bit more on this. But I think it's a worthwhile discussion to be able to unpack some of these things. Yeah. And this, by the way, for those that are listening, is an example of how two people who love each other, who are brothers in Christ, can just disagree with each other without getting angry with each other, without yelling each other down. I did poke at him a little bit here and there, and he poked at me a little bit. Yeah, we did a little bit of that, but we did with a smile on our face and love in our hearts for each other. And we can still worship together, and we can still continue to fellowship with one another as brothers in Christ. Is that to say that these discussions aren't important? No, it's simply to say that two people in a relationship can disagree with each other without being overly disagreeable. Anybody who's married has to learn that. Anybody who has children has to learn that. Yeah. So we've got to learn maturity and disagreeing with others without shouting each other down or calling each other names. So thank you, Chris, for modeling that and being a model of Christian love and understanding, even though we do disagree with each other. I appreciate that about you. And I pray that people will follow the example that they've seen in our discourses over the years and our continued discourses. I know we'll probably talk more, but
my hope is we do, because I really enjoy it.
Well, God bless, my friend.
You as well.
And we will see you guys next time. I'm going to try to figure out where to push the button.